Hey everybody. My name is Golnar Nikpour. I'm a professor of history in our Department of History. I welcome you all to this talk, which is the second of two teach-ins that the department is having on histories of student protest, mainly in the US, I think, but today's talk is a little bit different from what those of you who were here on Friday might have seen. On Friday, Professors Rabig and Annalise, Professors Rabig and Orlek and Professor Ed Miller from our department talked about different political movements that happened on Dartmouth's campus and responses by varying administrations on those movements. Today, Professor Zeinstra and I are going to talk about solidarity movements, student solidarity movements with political movements from around the world, and particularly in the global south, in Africa and West Asia, sometimes known as the Middle East. So I'm taking the Middle East portion, and then I'll hand it over to Robbie. So my idea for today, I was sort of going through what I thought would be useful to help us contextualize both the student movement that we've seen emerge on this campus and on campuses all over the world in solidarity with Palestine, and to sort of think about how different groups of students have navigated the complex political waters of talking about the Middle East, in not only in the Middle East, but in the US in particular. So today I'll be talking about the early history of student protests in the US undertaken in solidarity with, or in many cases organized by transnational networks of Arab, Iranian, and Black students, and related to the politics of the Middle East. I'll be mostly looking at the 1960s to the 1980s, though I might sort of gesture to things happening now. It was a very different moment politically than the one that we're in part because the Middle East wasn't actually on people's radars in the same way that it is now. You have to sort of imagine a moment where the United States hasn't actually been occupying or militarily engaged in the Middle East for all of our lifetimes. Literally my entire lifetime, all of the students' lifetimes, maybe a few of you remember a time when the US wasn't occupying or otherwise invading or bombing the Middle East. But in the 1960s, the big war, the sort of worry among anti-war activists, of course, was Vietnam. It was a different sort of geopolitical moment of the Cold War. And so in some ways, although talking about these issues, particularly Palestine, but not only Palestine, was even less mainstream than it is now. It was even less mainstream to express solidarity with these revolutionary movements. In some ways, the field was much more open because there was not a sort of active and organized right-wing hostility to those conversations. Now, the 1960s and 70s were, generally speaking, an era of massive global uprising. And students were key cogs in these broader movements. Now, as such, we'll see that these student movements interacted widely with other movements of the era, from anti-Vietnam War protesters to labor organizers to women and women's liberation protesters and revolutionary movements around the world. Now, I'm talking about this era in particular because, in my view, it represents the origin point for student protests in the Middle East, distinctly and directly linked to the Middle East, with an emphasis on a few key geographic locations: Palestine, Israel, Algeria, which had a revolutionary war that lasted from most of the 50s into the 1960s, Iran, which had a big revolution in 1979, and to a lesser extent, Yemen and Oman, which also had revolutions in that era. As such, I'd like to start with a provisional argument that we should really think of this global 1960s moment as the launching point for the student-led campus-based Palestine solidarity movement in the United States, which, as we all have seen, has very much been in the global public eye of late. But as I was saying, although this moment is interesting from our contemporary vantage point for the reason I just outlined, it's also quite different. There was, of course, backlash to these young activists from a variety of figures. But as I said, the Middle East had not yet become a particularly important node in the political imaginary of most Americans. It was not the post-9/11 moment. It was not the global war on terror. There was ambient sort of Orientalism and Islamophobia in the air, but it wasn't sort of directed in the same way as it becomes in a later moment. So hopefully this presentation helps put some of these contemporary movements and our current vexed campus conversation into a deeper historical context. So I also want to issue a couple of brief caveats about the terms I'm using before I get into it. I would not be a historian if I didn't do that. First, I want to just say that a lot of what I'll be talking about is not actually my own research, and I want to make sure I don't take credit for too much of it. There's a lot of recent literature on student movements, Middle Eastern student movements in the US, and how they interact with Black student movements in particular, and Jewish student and leftist movements more broadly, right? Almost all of these books has been written in the last decade, except for the one on the very far right, which was written in the 90s, hence its kind of more 90s graphic design. This is a kind of new area of interest for, generally speaking, Middle East diaspora studies, sort of trying to think about the way in which Middle Eastern diasporas in the US actually have influenced and affected politics back home in ways that haven't always been grasped by earlier generations of scholars. So I really recommend all of these books. They're quite amazing. So if you walk out of here remembering nothing else, remember that history and this sort of deep reading is a path towards political, moral, and civic clarity. As Malcolm X himself once said in his famed message to the grassroots speech, of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. Yeah, so that's my pitch. I'll be teaching here all the next 6 months if you, if you want to come join me. Now, I also want to issue what my students in the room will know is my typical caveat about the term I'm using to reference the region sort of here-ish, which is the Middle East and North Africa. Middle East is a term I use extremely uncomfortably. I never use it without issuing this caveat. It's a shorthand that's useful because we know what countries we're talking about, but ultimately it's that we have a danger of lumping profoundly diverse and disparate peoples, politics, conversations, languages, all into one kind of, like Muslim goop is how we kind of see it. And it's dangerous also because, in fact, these were really contested categories for these students. They're not, Middle East is not an indigenous category, right? It's a category that is sort of invention of, Near East is an invention of European imperial imaginary, Middle East becomes popularized in the American Cold War imaginary. But even those terms that are indigenous, Arab, Iranian, Kurdish, whatever, are contested in this time. Who belongs, who doesn't, who's fits into the national mold. How do we think about Arabness, Arab Americanness, Iranian Americanness, blackness? These are all contested terms. So that's sort of, and so in these moments of social turmoil and rupture, during mass movements, revolutions, wars, these categories don't always hold together. Okay, what do I mean when I talk about the global 60s? Often, when we hear these terms in the popular and even some scholarly quarters, conversations about this era tend to center the US and Europe, and the efflorescence of civil rights and student, revolutionary, women's, and queer liberation movements, anti-war movements, alongside new youth countercultures. The touchstone in this conventional imaginary are the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements in the US, often led by students, though not always, on the one hand, as well as an enormous student and worker-led uprising in France in May 1968. This is one of the famous photos that probably some of you have seen of a solitary student facing down against a wall of police. In May 68 in France, the movement saw upwards of 10 million students and workers come together for wildcat strikes and massive protests. Naturally, this enormous protest movement saw a great deal of press, right? As I hope is clear, students were at the epicenter of all of these world-changing efforts. But many scholars, myself included, have noted that although the spirit of protest associated with the 1960s is best understood as global, rather than located primarily in the global north. For instance, in Iran, which I study, there was also an enormous student protest movement in 1968, and it predates the French movement. So it's not to say like, oh, they deserve the credit or the French. It's more about a kind of moment where a lot of people in similar situations around the world are sort of seeing and responding to each other's efforts coterminously, right? And I would go a step further and place the epicenter of these movements in the global south. That's a big part of what I want to talk about today. Across the part of the world that was, after all, in this moment, in the process of decolonization. And in my view, there is simply no way to overemphasize the historical significance of decolonization to the story of the 20th and 21st centuries. Anti-colonial movements quite literally remapped the entire world. Whereas in the late 19th century, in the era of high European imperialism, over 85% of the Earth's surfaces, and thus almost all of the world's peoples, were under direct European colonial domination. Within just a few decades, this imperial order was crumbling, if not crumbled. I mean, there are still colonial contexts today, but the idea of colonialism certainly has become sort of anathema to most people, and most colonial states have been decolonized. Now, scholars, myself included, and for good reason, have spent the better part of the last number of years and decades analyzing myriad failures of these anti-colonial revolutions. Why didn't these movements succeed in building the truly just worlds that they promised? These are urgent questions, but for our purposes, I'd like us to sort of situate ourselves in the ideas animating the student movements that I'm talking about, before that kind of awareness of those essentially revolutionary failures, sense of loss that comes with them, before that starts to really sink in. I'd like us to spend the next 10, 15 minutes with me, and then with Robbie, in what French philosopher Michel Foucault once called standing at the threshold of possibility, believing that you are really going to change not only a small thing, but the entire structure of things. Just some graphics to go along with what I'm saying. Yeah, and this was a global imaginary. It brought peoples from all over the world into conversation with each other and believing in each other's movements and seeing their movements as linked. And I also want to note here that in the 1960s, in this era, this revolutionary imagination, as we see in at least two of these three images, although in the third one too, with Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara, you can kind of imagine it, that these were militant movements. These were movements that explicitly championed the taking up of arms to transform the world, for better or worse. And I think that's something also that we have to sort of contend with. It's a difference in some of the ways in which we think about our links to movements today. The students championed these movements in all of their sort of militant, in all of their militancy in many cases, even if they didn't necessarily use those same tactics at home. So that's sort of another thing another contradiction we can think of going forward. But here I'll skip to the end of my story. In February 1979, an enormous mass movement succeeded in overthrowing a US-backed dictatorship in Iran. Iran's then king, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown and a novel formation called the Islamic Republic of Iran emerged. Now, Iran's revolution can be thought of as a bookend, both a bookend and a new beginning. Iranian revolutionaries saw themselves as the inheritors of the great anti-colonial revolutions that had shaped the world over the last decades. They were reading the work of Martinique-born Black revolutionary and philosopher Frantz Fanon. This version of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, I put the English language version in the middle just for context. This version of Wretched of the Earth was published before the revolution in 1979, that one just after the revolution. They were reading the same materials that all of these student movements were reading, and they saw their movement in that context. At the same time, Iran's 1979 revolution puts itself in an Islamist idiom, the first of its kind, and it's that politics that comes to really define the next generation in the Middle East. But I bring that up because I also want us to understand and think through and sort of dwell in the fact that in the 1960s, these Arab and Iranian students and the movements to which they belong back home are largely secular in orientation and leftist. The sort of Islamist movements that we associate with the region are not really going to become mainstream until the 1980s. That doesn't mean that they don't exist at all, but that they're not quite part of the the climate that these students are the waters through which these students are swimming. I begin with this revolution because it helps us look at history, historically, at a question I've heard from several students lately. Have student movements ever really changed anything? Now, the Iranian Revolution shows, in my view, that yes, definitively. Simply put, this revolution would not have happened without the Herculean efforts of an absolutely enormous student movement mobilizing both inside and outside of the country. The student movement has been called by Afshin Matin Askari, and this is a quote, the most active and persistent force of opposition to the Shah's regime during the 2 decades prior to the revolution. It's one of the most successful student movements in modern history. And it was particularly manned by expatriate students in the US and especially Europe, but for today I'll talk more about the US context. Largely leftists of various stripes, although some Islamists were in the mix as well, who succeeded in changing the Shah's reputation from a modern and progressive monarch to the king of torture. And they were extremely ambitious in the actions that they undertook. There's one on the right. This was their newsletter, their US-based newsletter, Resistance. And on the right, you see they hung banners from the Statue of Liberty that say, "Down with the Shah, free the 18." The 18 were student activists who were arrested. And in 1977, probably their biggest public relations triumph, the Shah was meeting with Carter. You see the headline, and they released like a poison gas into the air that got so close that got on the White House lawn to the point where the Shah couldn't take the napkins off his eyes. So they were based on campuses, but their movement, they didn't sort of think only about campus as the context in which they would take up their work. And they worked extremely closely eventually with Amnesty International, and although they were revolutionaries for the most part, they were also perfectly happy to work with people from sort of liberal parliamentarians, liberal human rights organizations, whatever it took to publicize this idea that this king, that the number one thing you should associate with this king was torture. And I'll share just one anecdote. I have like 1,000 of these, so if anyone wants to hear stories about students disrupting things, let me know. But I will share just one anecdote from the Iranian student movement as a way of giving some context for it. It's been on my mind for reasons that will probably be obvious. So in summer of '64, the UCLA had a controversy brewing. The university had decided to grant an honorary degree to none other than Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And the problem was, and this happened a lot actually, American universities were constantly trying to give the Shah honorary degrees and having their commencements ruined by students protesting. You'd think that they would have just been like, we don't need to give this guy an honorary degree, it's just not that important. The problem for UCLA was that there were many Iranian students at the university, most of whom viewed the Shah as a dictator. In the lead up to commencement, the UCLA branch of the Iranian Students Association, or ISA, they're the people who put out this newsletter, released a pamphlet addressed to all fair-minded people and student organizations at UCLA seriously interested in upholding the principles of academic freedom. And they demanded that the Shah be disinvited from campus. The students also successfully appealed to student government to formally support their cause. And this was actually quite common as well, tactically, to first start with a protest, then to move to student government, try to get faculty support. So you see some of the same tactical and sort of conceptual ideas of trying to get campus support for a cause. Now, for their part, UCLA administration refused to back down. But the student movement, which was, as I've noted, like other movements of the time, becoming increasingly militant in its demands, similarly was in no mood to concede. As scholar Manija Moradian notes, quote, "The ISA took advantage of the mass audience provided by the commencement ceremony in order to turn the stadium into a scene of one of its most spectacular actions." Sorry, guys. She quotes at length from one of the former students. And this is a quote from one of the students about the act that they undertook. Quote, We talked with the progressive Americans, their allies, who were getting a degree that as soon as the Shah started giving his speech, all those graduates started walking out. Around that time, some anti-drug organization had printed something about Ashraf, the Shah's twin sister, about her importing heroin into Iran. That's a true story. One of these Americans had a flight license, one of the progressive Americans. We rented a small plane, and it flew over the stadium with a banner, "Need a fix? See the Shah." Police helicopters had to be called to try to force him down, but he wouldn't land, so it attracted even more attention, end quote. Ultimately, there's several more things that happen over the course of this protest action, but the students ultimately succeeded in utterly shutting down commencement, which was being held in a sports stadium. So they brought it to a complete halt. Local police and Iranian secret police, which operated quite freely in the United States at the time, removed some protesting students violently. But there were so many hundreds of them that they continued the protest outside. The Shah was not able to speak. Now, why were there so many Iranians in the US at the first place on these campuses? At their height, I'm talking about tens of thousands of students at any given time. And across the US and Europe, over the course of that time, there were hundreds of thousands of Iranian students. Well, ironically, given their revolutionary disposition, many were paid for by the Shah's government. Many of their educations was paid for by the Shah's government with help from an enormous amount of US funding. For Iran, this was an effort to ensure loyalty among the perpetually unruly intelligentsia, as well as to train a technocratic class capable of further developing the country. For the Cold War United States, it was funding meant to create a dedicated anti-communist cadre of native elites who would help stave off Soviet influence. The ISA was founded in the 1950s with CIA funding and was tasked with making sure students remained loyal to the Shah. They clearly failed. Students wrestled control away from the Pahlavi loyalists quite early on and eventually moved from their sort of early nationalist, liberal, constitutionalist posture to increasingly militant forms of revolutionary Marxism and third worldism, and in a few cases, Islamism. Now, the movement was changing in Iran, too. That was the exact trajectory that the opposition movement took inside the country. For most of the early part of the 20th century, into the 50s and even the 60s, the movement attempted, dissidents and opposition parties attempted to work within the system. They attempted to change Iran from within. Really, after a 1953 coup in Iran organized by the US, there is a sense of kind of defeat. Like, we've just been beaten. And in the 60s and into the 70s, a new generation of young Iranians starts to say, well, we can't change the system from within. The only thing that's going to work is guns. So a guerrilla movement emerges in 1971. It also becomes really the sort of North Star for the student movement. They come to really adopt the posture and language of the guerrillas because in some part they're the same people. Like, they're going back and forth, they're training in different places. Now, not all the students were guerrillas, and for the most part, the tactics they used in the US were nonviolent. But again, we have to understand this as a sort of strange moment where Amnesty International is championing Iranian students who are championing armed insurrection. At the same time, it's like not championing, it's saying Nelson Mandela is not a prisoner of conscience because he's taken up arms, right? So there's real tensions in the coalitions between liberals and militants that is, I can only gloss, but is still important to understand. Now, in this same era, how much time do I have? Yeah, in this same era, there was also a growing number of Arab students in the US. This growing community founded the Organization of Arab Students in the 1950s. An organization that, while it was not government funded, like the Iranian Students Org, was nonetheless initially founded to be a basically apolitical sort of social guild meant to help students kind of connect to professional networks. The OAS becomes increasingly radical as the 50s and 60s drag on, very much like the Iranian movement. There were many revolutionary movements for the Arab students to support, some of the students also had links to these movements back home. Revolution in Algeria, in the Dhofar Revolution of Oman, revolutionary movements in North and South Yemen. Still, the Arab students were an extremely diverse group. Differences of language, of sort of dialect, of religion. Some were first gen, some were second gen, some were third gen. So category Arab American wasn't always, it was hard to keep it together. But as historian Pamela Pennock notes, there was one issue that brought all of these students together, even when they disagreed. And sometimes there would be political rifts, like the Arab states having political rifts, and thus the students not wanting to be in the same organization with each other. But the one issue on which they were united was Palestine. Pennock notes, the issue that most united and galvanized Arab Americans across differences of generation, social class, religion, national origin was their shared outrage over the dispossession of Palestinians through the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, this was particularly true in places where there were a lot of Arab immigrants, which already by that time meant Michigan. And the movement was enormous at places like Wayne State. And at one point, the Arab Students Association essentially took over the student newspaper, and all the student newspaper published for years was material on Palestine. I mean, imagine that happening. And the administration didn't like it, but they also didn't stop it because it was just the overwhelming majority of the students were on board. So that's just a sort of aside about the way in which these moments are a bit politically different. Okay, let me think. Now, the OAS came of age politically in the immediate aftermath of the June Arab-Israeli War in 1967. Lasting 6 days, the June War was a cataclysm for the Arab states. Approximately 350,000 Palestinians were forced from their land. This after 750,000 were dispossessed in 1948. And several, what were then newly independent Arab states lost territory in the process. Syria lost the Golan Heights, Egypt the Sinai Peninsula, and the West Bank, which was at that time under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip as well. All of the above remain under Israeli military occupation, with the exception of the Sinai. Now, after 67, there was a sea change in Arab politics. Before that, and I can't get into it too much, but before that, there was a kind of Arab nationalist movement that claimed Arabness as the category through which, as the sort of identity category through which politics should and could happen. And it was led by an Egyptian leader by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Palestinian movement was championed by the Egyptians, but ultimately that movement was seen as lost in 67. A new generation of Palestinians comes of age at this point, mostly raised in refugee camps after 48, championing the idea that if there is to be Palestinian liberation, if there is to be any sort of liberated Palestinian state that has self-determination, Palestinians have to do it by their own hands. This ethos is absolutely taken up by the students as well, right? There's a lot of Palestinian students in the US at this time, and they also sort of start to champion the new organizations that come out of this new militant ethos, including Al-Fatah, the Yasser Arafat's organization, the PLO, which had been founded by Egyptians, is sort of wrestled away from them by Palestinians, and the Palestine Liberation Organization. So yeah, the students are also championing these essentially guerrilla movements as well. I'm almost done. It was in this context that Middle Eastern students increasingly agitated on behalf of Palestinian liberation. But it wasn't just students, and the Iranian students did too. The Arab students, the Palestinian, and the Iranian students were both really fixated in many cases on the Palestinian movement. But scholars also took up the issue. After the June War, there was an extremely important new organization founded called the Association of Arab American University Graduates, which was an avowedly secular, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist organization. That's how it described itself. And these university graduates were, in many cases, professors. One of the sort of giants of that movement was a scholar by the name of Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, who wrote these books. And the AAUG was instrumental in sort of changing not only campus, but broader intellectual conversations on Palestine and Israel, which until that point were dominated by sort of American foreign policy visions and by a narrative Zionist narrative of sort of reclaiming lost land, and particularly of the great sort of victory of 1967. The AAUG saw itself as a space in which people could learn about history in ways that they weren't getting otherwise. And as such, they were extremely influential in the field of Middle East studies. Some of the real giants of 20th century Middle East studies were affiliated with AAUG, who saw themselves as activist scholars very much in that new left mold that was popular across campuses and across different political movements, and particularly, that was sort of, that was popular all over the world as a kind of new way to do intellectual work. Unsurprisingly, given the tenor of the day, the AAUG also promoted gender equality, socialism, and a broader commitment to third worldist revolutionary politics. Now, Arab and Iranian students were key to bringing Middle Eastern politics to the university, but the most important group, those who really punctured the American mainstream in what was then and now a radical critique of Zionism, were Black liberation groups, including Black student groups. The first and most important major civil rights organization to declare solidarity with Palestine was the legendary Black civil rights group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. When, in August 1967, SNCC activist Ethel Miner wrote an article in their newspaper giving full-throated support to the Palestinian cause. As Michael Fishback has noted, Miner's article was, quote, was the event that first rocketed the Black Power movement into the American public's view in terms of Black support for Palestinians and mixing of domestic racial identity with Middle Eastern politics. Now, established in 1960, SNCC was a student-based civil rights organization that became famous for its grassroots organizing among working-class Southern Black Americans. Never content with organizing for domestic civil rights alone, even in their earliest iterations, they often use the language of structural change. But as the 60s wore on, these global anti-colonial movements, as well as continued imbalances of structural racism and continued white supremacist violence, worked to push many Black activists towards increasingly third worldist positions. Now, there was, of course, pushback to SNCC's defense of Palestinian rights, both among their many detractors and critically among both mainstream Black organizations on the one hand, as well as some of SNCC's Jewish allies on the other. Now, remember, the civil rights movement was a movement that had at its heart a solidarity between Jewish and Black Americans. So this caused sort of serious conversations. And in fact, SNCC understood that it would. And it had a lot of internal conversations about what it would do and how it should think about making this sort of what they thought was taking a moral position on the issue of Palestine. In May 67, Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown shocked their friend and SNCC lawyer Donald Jelinek, who was Jewish, by coming out in support of the Palestinian cause. Now, as Jelinek recounts, it was a shock to me, he said, when my SNCC friends even mildly indicated support for the Arabs. End quote. Some in the organization thought it was political suicide to weigh in on Palestine. As James Foreman, a key SNCC activist, wrote in a letter to another key figure in the movement, quote, "Any Black person of national stature who speaks against Israel must expect isolation from the press. I'm trying to make an analysis, and I'm not saying that we should be worried about these matters, but we do need to analyze them. If by chance or by design we were to take a position on the Arab-Israeli war, such as we took on the war in Vietnam, the reaction would be fantastic against us. I'm not personally sure we can take a position at this moment." And yet for Foreman, the moral imperative was clear. Is it or is it not sheer opportunism, he continued, to keep silent for the sake of trying to please the crowd? How are we going to lead people within the United States and relate them to international forces when we ourselves are too afraid to say those things that we know are true? Now, Foreman's letter gets at the heart of what was a genuine divide in the Black civil rights movement, Black Power movement, not only among Black organizations, but a divide that actually divided the leftist movement in the US more generally. The New Left movement, the fight against racism, against Vietnam War, in part because at that time, that was probably a high watermark among Jewish leftists for support for Israel after the victory of the war. Although I should note that a book called Our Palestine Question by historian Jeffrey Levin looks at the extent to which the question of Palestinian rights has never been a consensus matter in the Jewish community. It's a really good book. Now, there's a great deal more to this story. I've already talked way too much, sorry, Robbie. But I want to end here with just mentioning a couple of takeaways. In this era, in part through the lens of American racial politics, a new solidarity with Arab political movements, particularly with Palestine, came to flourish on American campuses and start to puncture the American mainstream. This was itself the result of a new global ethos that called for revolution and decolonization across communities that were newly being understood as communities of color. Now, this was a language that's being used at the time. Now, unsurprisingly, these campus politics were often sort of promoted by Arab and Iranian students, but as I've said today, the most consequential support, the most sort of historically dramatic support for the Palestinian liberation movement came from Black students and Black political organizations who saw themselves as kindred spirits in the fight against the global color line. Now, today there's a similar multiracial, multi-ethnic movement that has formed across college campuses to talk about Palestine. But today's movement's a little bit different because it's also disproportionately Jewish. If we look at and this is something that my colleague, Professor Annalise Orlek, has pointed out in many excellent interviews the last few weeks. If you look at the roles of who's being arrested, of who's being harassed, they're very much like the 60s civil rights movement, where among white students, Jews were wildly disproportionately part of those movements, anti-war movement, anti-racist movement. Jewish students are also disproportionately part of the Palestine solidarity movement, although, as is also quite clear in these movements, there's not a consensus among Jews on campus, on any given campus or on campus more broadly. Now, today's political moment is different. Gone are the guns and the berets of the revolutionary 60s, but the terrain of opposition has also changed with more robust administrative pushback, policing the so-called Palestine exception on our campuses. But we decided to organize this talk, and I end with what is my sincere hope that our students can lead the way to the more just future that all of our earlier movements tried to but didn't quite get to. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to have some similar points to Professor Nikpour here. But I'm here specifically to talk about Dartmouth's role in the anti-apartheid movement, specifically about this shantytown, which was built in November of 1985. I'm not going to speak a lot about the shantytown, but what I'm going to try to do is provide some context to the shantytown. Is it too loud? It's okay. Okay, yeah. So apartheid in South Africa was formalized decades before November 1985, when this was put up. This kind of begs the question for me. If apartheid was formalized in 1948, when the National Party won South Africa's elections, why did it take nearly 40 years for Dartmouth students to demand their university's financial divestment from the South African state? So this is obviously not a very good question, and I don't think we need to find an answer to it. Also, if we listen to Professor Nikpour, we can understand there's so much going on in this period other than worrying about South Africa. But regardless, a brief narrative journey through the domestic and international reactions to apartheid can provide some clues. So to tell this story of American student activists' role in helping end apartheid, with any semblance of chronology is hard for me, I will oscillate between US and South African stories. Okay. So first, if you've taken a class with me, you'll know that the legal foundations of apartheid long predated 1948. Apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans, is at its core racial segregation, or the physical, legal, and social separation of individuals based on constructed racial categories. Segregation, perhaps unsurprisingly, was central to the long settler colonial project in Southern Africa, with segregationist laws gaining steam in the latter half of the 19th century in order to control workers arriving at the gold and diamond mines in and around the Transvaal and Kimberley. The United States' own version of apartheid differed slightly in its interpretation of the basic racial categories, which were to be legislated, but the fundamental tenets and motivations were the same. Throughout the 20th century, Pan-Africanists and civil rights activists in the United States recognized these similarities and connected their struggles. I think I can switch. In July 1948, less than 2 months after Jan Smuts lost the election to the National Party's D.F. Malan, the NAACP's official magazine, The Crisis, edited at the time by Roy Wilkins, wrote, "As a racial reactionary, General Smuts was bad, but the Nazi-minded Dr. Malan is worse. General Smuts did build a reputation up abroad as a liberal and a statesman, but is largely phony and did not for a moment fool that small band of South African liberals who know their local racial situation to be intolerable. General Smuts' statesmanship has been largely exercised in keeping the natives in their place. Now along comes the even more reactionary Dr. Malan, who proposes to take away the few rights his predecessor has grudgingly conceded to the Gullards and the natives." Okay, I can give you the next slide. So this was really early Crisis magazine, just so you can see. It was more diverse, it's quite beautiful. But by the 1940s through the 1960s, it ends up looking more like this. It's still pretty punk, but it's more uniform. So the Crisis magazine continued to report on the development of apartheid in South Africa every year for the following 4 decades. In 1954, in an article titled "Apartheid at Universities," they reported on Malan's address to the graduation ceremony at the University of Stellenbosch, where Malan said, "The academic mixing of white and non-white at 2 of our largest and most important universities, UCT and WITS, is an anomaly which is becoming increasingly serious in its proportions and implications, and which ought to be removed at the earliest opportunity." Dr. Malan then claimed that there is no injustice and nothing unchristian in apartheid. The idea of equality is a small human concept and not a great divine concept. A decade later, in 1960, in what would become known as the Sharpeville Massacre, nearly 300 protesters were shot during a large assembly at a provincial police station in South Africa. Quite an insignificant town, Sharpeville, but it was the site of this major scene of violence. The Pan-Africanist Congress, and there's a backstory here. The Pan-Africanist Congress and the ANC wanted slightly different things. ANC was non-racialist. The Pan-African Congress was not on board with non-racialism. And nonetheless, and the ANC had planned some protests, some pass law protests. The PAC wanted to preempt them. So it planned this pass law protest in this small township. So the PAC-led action, attended by as many as 10,000 students and workers, was organized so that the crowd could forfeit their identity passes at the police station en masse, forcing their arrest. It was a challenge to apartheid's legal system, under which non-whites were arrestable if caught without their pass. A crime or protest which led to nearly 17 million arrests by the end of apartheid. So this was the largest form of protest in South Africa. Rather than arrest and process the entire large group, the Sharpeville police called for reinforcements from riot police and armored vehicles, which we saw recently. Ian Barry, the photographer who captured the event's most famous imagery, reported that the crowd was not initially intimidated by the riot police, which was a normal occurrence when non-whites gathered to challenge apartheid's laws. But in the following minutes, the police and the armored vehicles opened fire on the crowd, killing at least 69 and wounding nearly 200 more. And the moral injury of the massacre was unquantifiable. So let me just jump through these slides here. So you can see what these armored vehicles look like. You could see some normal reaction. Some people have their thumbs up, which I don't understand, but this kind of fits Barry's description. People were not scared. You see people mulling around in front of these armored vehicles. And then there are many more photos that he took, but I don't want to show them. So I'll end with these couple of photos of people running. And he even reported that it took a while for people to start running after the shooting started from the police. So that's as far as we're going to get. The founder and founding editor of the NAACP's The Crisis magazine, W.E.B. Du Bois, was also acutely aware of South Africa's comparable system of racial injustice, comparable to the United States, although he was nearing the end of his life and finalizing his exile to Ghana. Immediately following the event, the New York-based Action for South Africa sent Du Bois a letter asking for Pan-African solidarity. So this is in 1961, they send this letter. And I'm going to read this letter, because this is where students start to come in. So they write, United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld has recently carried out the Security Council instructions of April 1st, 1960, and visited South Africa. His report indicates that he has not been able to effect any change in either the government's attitudes or its policies. In fact, the absence of effective external pressure upon South Africa has made it possible for the government to consolidate its position since the Sharpeville massacre of last March. The African political parties and leadership have been neutralized. So the ANC, the PAC, they were all banned. Over 60 Africans have lost their lives in revolt against government provocation in Pondo land, which is now sealed off from the outside world by military barricades. New censorship regulations have been declared. The South African Foundation, a multi-million-dollar endowed organization whose express purpose is to whitewash the actions of the South African government, is hard at work spending enormous amounts of money in their efforts to influence, by misrepresentation and omission, the European and American communications media to present a false picture of the explosive situation in South Africa. The international territory of Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, has virtually become an armed camp where the government continues arbitrary arrest and deportations of political leaders. Military reinforcements are arriving daily from South Africa, and a European civilian militia of Sket commandos has been organized. So these are mercenaries I'm talking about. A United Nations investigating commission has been refused admission to the territory, and war has broken out in Angola. There is clearly a job to be done in the United States, both to inform the public of events in South Africa, Southern Africa, and to elicit support for direct action against apartheid. So this is one of many organizations that popped up in the United States to start encouraging people to act in solidarity with South Africa. So what this letter shows is that more than 2 decades before American university students built encampments to demand divestment, the seeds were being sown for action against South Africa's financial enablers around the world. Due to international outrage at the Sharpeville massacre, the South African government's credit began to tank, but was promptly stabilized with the help of emergency loans provided by Chase Manhattan Bank. Back in South Africa, anti-apartheid activists reflected on the violence of 1960, and parallel to international calls for nonviolent solidarity, leaders of the ANC and the Communist Party made the decision to take up arms and form Umkhonto we Sizwe, also known as MK. I bring this up because it's important to recognize the diversity of tactics at play. Nonviolent international activism was symbiotic with MK's sabotage and guerrilla action, which began cautiously, but within a decade became more violent than even they had anticipated in their 1961 manifesto. So starting with sabotage, but there is more and more death and murder. Even Nelson Mandela, you can see in jail, is quite uncomfortable with what ends up happening a decade later, 2 decades later. Nonetheless, this is what it looks like. The turn toward armed self-defense in South Africa did not deter international solidarity. The 2 tactics were complementary. So this is similar to what Professor Nikpour was saying. Within 3 years, on April 1964, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, Amanda Kathrada was a Gujarati Indian in the east coast of South Africa. Dennis Goldberg, who was one of many Lithuanian communist Jews in Cape Town. Raymond Mlaba, Elias Motsoaledi, and Andrew Mlangeni were charged with sabotage and sentenced to life in prison. At the conclusion of the Rivonia trial, where they were all sentenced, Nelson Mandela gave a 3-hour speech which became his most famous, and you'll recognize the following lines. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination. I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. 4 months later, Martin Luther King Jr. drew parallels between Jim Crow in the United States and apartheid in South Africa, and his 1964 testimony to the Democratic National Convention. And in Europe, where he traveled to accept the Nobel Peace Prize that same year, he again made the comparison and went further to call for economic sanctions against South Africa. In 1965, the New York chapter of Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which Professor Nikpour also talked about, staged a sit-in at the headquarters of Chase Manhattan Bank to protest their role in stabilizing and funding South Africa's economy in the wake of the targeted murder of activists and the banning of anti-apartheid political parties, including the ANC. I think I have a photo of that, actually. Yeah, it's a great photo. It's the only photo I could find. Anyways. So a lot of this history has been written by one historian named Bradford Martin, who came to Dartmouth, worked in Ronner, and wrote a chapter about Dartmouth called Unsightly Huts, which I recommend everyone read. So from here on out, I'm going to be quoting a bit from him. So he says, by the beginning of the 1970s, students concerned with social responsibility in university investments representing Princeton, Cornell, Union Theological Seminary, and Wesleyan had initiated calls for divestment. At Cornell, the faculty joined the action, including a resolution for the university to avoid investments that supported South African apartheid. In 1976, school children, I'm switching back to South Africa now. In 1976, school children in Soweto, an African township adjacent to Joburg, organized rallies and riots protesting the compulsory teaching of Afrikaans. The police fired tear gas and live ammunition on demonstrating students. So these aren't just university students. These are largely primary school and secondary school students. Officially, 176 protesters were killed, but actual estimates were much higher. Many of the students were killed at or near their own school, Orlando West High School. The following year, let me just give you some more of these photos. So, huge demonstration. All the schools emptied out. They had organized the strike. And just for some context, I don't have very much time. Afrikaans is a widely spoken language in South Africa. It's not something we need to demonize, but it's something that these students said they didn't want to be forced to learn. And again, there are so many photos from this event that I am not going to show you. This is the last one that I will show you. You can look that up on your own if you're interested. Okay. I want to get off this photo, actually. Okay. The following year, police beat to death the beloved Black consciousness leader, Stephen Biko, whose open casket funeral was attended by at least 20,000 people, the first major political funeral in South African history. You can find video footage of this online. It's quite beautiful, but very sad. Among many dignitaries in attendance was Black American diplomat Donald McHenry, Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. These two atrocities renewed international attention on apartheid, South Africa, and sparked a new wave of anti-apartheid activism on campuses across the United States. So this is what we see here. Don't remember which is which, but oh my gosh, a tent. Crossing the line. Don't remember where this is, but you could see Afrikaans not spoken here. There was a high demonization of Afrikaans, which has calmed down a bit now that apartheid is gone. Yeah, MIT had a nice encampment. And I suppose that's Dartmouth? Yeah. That is Dartmouth? Yeah. Great. Should have been more clear about that. One student at Dartmouth reported, "This could go on, and somehow our money would still be involved." Oh, sorry, I think I skipped. Let me just go back. Beginning in 1982, a new wave of solidarity protests exploded at college campuses in the United States, and this time with a clarity of demands, divestment. One student reported, "This could go on, and somehow our money was involved." And that mass participation among the students was due to an understanding of the implications of one's money being involved. There was something directly compelling about that. In November 1985, Dartmouth students pitched their protest camp in shape of the shanty towns that were already popular on other American campuses. 2 days before Dartmouth pro-divestment forces, I'm almost done here, hammered their first nail, the Dartmouth ran a feature on their plans for the shanties. So trying to preempt and in some ways disallow this to happen. Complete with details on the previous spring's struggles at Cornell, alerting the Dartmouth community and the Hanover community to the structure's impending construction. 2 days later, the newspaper announced that construction was to begin that day, Friday, November 15th, and quoted Dartmouth Community for Divestment, DCD, Joshua Stein on the rationale for the shanties. So that was a quote from Bradford Martin as well. When two shanties first appeared on Dartmouth Green in mid-November 1985, college administrators initially stated that they could remain standing for 3 days. After this grace period, administrators stressed that the shanties needed to be taken down, or they would be dismantled. But instead of taking the shanties down, the students escalated and built a third hut, and the trustees backed down. And they ensured the students that the huts could stay and that they were going to protect the protesters from counter-protesters. Our primary concern, I'm quoting the university administration, our primary concern right now is for the safety of the students who are expressing their right to protest. We are trying to be sensitive to the issue, but it's a difficult position for the college. When a coalition of 12 students from the Dartmouth Review attacked the huts in the middle of the night, I think this is sometime in February. So, oh, okay, thank you. Dartmouth administration punished those responsible for the sabotage. The shanties were moved before Winter Festival, and the protest ran its course and was disassembled. By 1989, Dartmouth divested from companies doing business in South Africa, joining more than 150 other schools. Much of the conversation about the shanties on the green at Dartmouth has centered on whether or not they were an eyesore. But to me, that is not interesting. I tend to agree that they were an eyesore, but that was precisely the point. The glaring, violent inequalities of apartheid were an eyesore, and Dartmouth students brought these aesthetic contradictions to the campus, and they won. That's all. Thank you. I suppose we stay up here. Do you want one of these nice microphones?
Nice what?
Microphones.
Thank you. How's your throat feeling after that?
I don't know.
Yes.
There's an aftermath to what happened.
Yeah.
The movement did not fall apart.
Mm-mm.
And so Dartmouth sanctioned they were from the Dartmouth Review, the students who attacked the shanty with 2 students sleeping in it. And, but the sanction was maybe a term off. And
Yeah, they were suspended.
They were suspended for a
Yeah.
term. And the DCD, the Dartmouth Community for Divestment, felt that that was insufficient for what they did. They could have, harmed the two students in there. So in reaction, they actually took over the bell tower
I didn't know that.
at Baker and held the bell tower for several days, and the state police were threatening to rappel them down. And professors, Ivy Schweitzer and history professor Leo Spitzer they were able to talk them down, and they left on their own. But they also were sanctioned, and the seniors were not allowed to walk in graduation. But the community during graduation, put up a little shanty on the green. It was on Baker lawn, the graduation. And all of the parents and families had to walk by the shanty. And so Rajiv Menon, one of the seniors who was not allowed to march in graduation, did. And there were state police there. And they grabbed him after he walked off the stage. And the mother of one of the students who did walk in graduation, but was a close friend of his, was so upset at what the police were doing to Rajiv that she attacked the police who were holding him down. And she was arrested. And it took a long time for Dartmouth to actually divest. It wasn't until the 90s.
3 years.
Well, they did divest from the Sullivan principles, but they didn't fully divest until the 90s. And I just want to say that the grandson of that woman was arrested on Wednesday, on May 1st.
Yeah, he was there with us on Wednesday.
Jordan, do you think that I should need to summarize, or do you think the microphone picked it up?
I think we got it. There's a right by this.
So I just want to say that the reason I didn't go too much into the Dartmouth, the reason I gave more context, is because we want to do an event at Special Collections who has all of this material, where we can really dive into Dartmouth's action. We haven't planned it yet, but we hope to.
It was great to see the context. It was great to see the South African pictures too. I learned a lot.
Yeah, Julia.
Well, I have a question. This wasn't the main focus of your presentation, so I don't know if you want to go there. But when you mentioned the CIA support for, was it the Iranian Student Association? I mean, that was really interesting to me in light of what you said earlier about how this region of the world, it's a different political moment from what we've been accustomed to since like all our lives, basically. But so did the CIA stop funding them when the politics of the students changed, or did they just?
Yeah,
were they
yeah,
too busy
absolutely. That's a great
surveilling other
question.
groups and-
Yes, they stopped funding them. I mean, in 1979, the revolution that happens in Iran really changes the relationship between the two countries. But what really changes the relationship between two countries is in November of that country when student activists take American diplomatic and military personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran hostage for over a year. Speaking of student activists that really changed the world, all sorts of directions students can take things. But yeah, these two events, the revolution itself and then the hostage crisis, totally transformed the relationship of the U.S. to the Iranian government. And all of that funding is not only does the funding dry up, but what is put in its place is an extremely sort of intense regime of sanctions that has, over the course of 40 years, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, cut Iran out of the global economy. So it's a pretty big about face. It really transforms the sort of the way in which the sort of nodes of power in the Middle East. And it's not really a focus of this talk, but that those changes, the way in which US policy sort of changes towards Iran after the revolution is a big part of how I understand Iranian investments in the region more broadly, like their sort of efforts to, I mean, they sort of are instrumental in the founding and continuation of Hezbollah. We know that they support to greater or lesser extent militias in Iraq and Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza and the Houthis in Yemen. Although they don't really actually do very much with the Houthis. That's like kind of fake news. But the point is that the way in which these geopolitics have changed is not only important for the students, but it actually dramatically changes the lay of the land in the Middle East more broadly. But the CIA was, I mean, this is something that they did, and I'm sure you know this in other contexts, like this, not just the CIA, but British intelligence, they pour a lot of money into anti-communism in the Middle East and into sort of promoting not only anti-communism, like in a kind of soft power way, where they're invested in what students are learning, what intellectuals are reading. I mean, there are still discoveries that we are making now, decades later, about journals we thought were independent journals in the 50s, 60s, or 70s that we are finding out were funded by the CIA or MI6 or whatever. So the intellectual lay of the land, even though the Middle East is not in the American imaginary what it becomes later, it's very important to the people in power. That is actually something I should clarify. When I say it's not less important, it's no less important to the people in power in the US, but it is just less well known. Like the issues are less well known to ordinary Americans, and they're not kind of fixated on the Middle East as a space of, like those people are not terrorists yet, if that makes sense, in the popular imaginary. So the students are not dealing with the same, there's a kind of, as I said, a kind of ambient racism because they're foreign, there's xenophobia, but it's not the same kind of virulent forms of Islamophobia that come to be after the hostage crisis and especially 9/11. Professor Orlek and then Kaya.
Yeah, I was wondering about communications across, across the oceans, and Rob, you both, and Golnar, just wondering if the students were talking to each other, and I would imagine, and how far back it goes, like Sharpeville, Soweto, are there communications? My work-study job in college, everybody who worked with me in the library were Iranian students who were very closely following everything that was going on, and it seemed like they were talking to their friends all the time, and I wondered also, because there's no cell phones, it's a much harder thing to do in those days. So, yeah, your thoughts, both of you.
Yeah, I could start. So South Africans were constantly traveling to London, specifically, and asking students and working with students, working with community organizers to take up the cause. So there was an in-person communication, there was a letter-based communication, specifically with London. By and large, my impression, though, is by the time it gets to the United States, there are direct lines of communication through these solidarity organizations. Yes, they are in touch with South Africans in the ANC, for example. But I think a lot of it is communicating through mimicry.
Through
mimicry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, for the Iranian students, there are members of the U.S. Of the student movement in the U.S. and Europe, and the student movement in Europe is even bigger in Germany and France. I mean, there's so many Iranian students in those countries in the 60s and 70s that they dramatically influence the course of movement history. Like Quinn Slobodian has written about this in European history. They're influential in terms of their not only in how they influence Iran, but how they influence movements on the ground. But the students are talking to each other. I mean, calling is hard, letters are slow, and everything is like they're very, very worried about intelligence gathering. With good reason, but there's still travel back and forth, and in fact some of the people are the same. Like they're students for a while and then they go back to Iran and they become guerrillas, or they're part of the movement in Iran and then they leave the country because, for whatever reason. But for the most part, the students are, but the average student, they're not necessarily connected in quite that way. But they're reading the pamphlets, and they're that kind of the level of militancy that would involve a student going back and joining the guerrilla movement is quite rare. Like actually the guerrilla movement was teeny tiny, even though it was very, very influential. It's only a few hundred people who are actually taking up arms, as opposed to the tens of thousands of students. They're reading the pamphlets, they're reading each other's work, they're somehow they're translating an enormous amount from Persian into English. That's what they saw as one of their main tasks and responsibilities, to translate Iranian movement material, or in some cases Palestinian or Algerian or Omani, especially. The Iranian revolutionaries get very invested in the Dhofar revolution in Oman, and they're translating a lot of that material too into English. So the Iranian students actually are much more visible on campuses actually than the Arab students. They're just a bigger population at this time. And one of the interesting things that I found in the archive is, they understand their role because they're welcome guests at this point. They're not viewed with suspicion. So as a result, they understand, they wouldn't have used this language at the time, but they understand their privilege, particularly in relation to Black student movements. So on campuses all across the US, it became the policy of the ISA to basically form a ring around Black students if they were organizing, to create buffers between police and Black students, to put their bodies between, to say, in the same way that we see in movements today, there are those who understand themselves, sometimes faculty, who understand themselves to be in positions of, in the hopes that police will either not do the violence, or if they do the violence, that they will be read as white in that context, and as not to be beaten, right? So there's all of these materials, and then you see on the other side, in the Black press and on the student press, and in the leftist press, when the revolution happens, there's all of these movement people who are like, even though we don't totally know what's happening in Iran, we don't totally understand the hostage crisis, we have to support these students. They had our backs. They stood by our sides. They took the batons to the head when those batons were meant for us. So you actually see these kind of material ways in which those student conversations actually change the movement. And because in Iran itself, there's a huge student movement in Iran itself, but the culture of suppression is so brutal, both before and after the revolution, that it's in exile or in diaspora that these students are actually able to engage much more openly with different movements, and so their politics change, and they go back and they're like, oh, you guys are weird Stalinists. We have because and they're Stalinists in some case, or deep authoritarian leftists out of necessity, right? Because information is so dangerous. But they also lose contact. To the question about whether they're in contact, they also have sectarian splits basically because of the differences in the way they're seeing politics, having engaged in a broader student movement at that point.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, Kaya.
Yeah, I think I resonate a lot with that. I was called a Stalinist myself over the years. It was really fun.
It's always good when you have to say that's a joke.
I'm not a Stalinist.
Yeah.
In the morning sometimes. But in UCLA, was it last week or the week before? There were really startling images of Iranian diaspora people attacking the encampments.
Yes.
And that's a long way from.
Yes.
This.
Those people were present in this era as well. But, okay, how to answer that? Is there more? Or did you just want to sort of?
It's just.
Is there more?
It's a different group of people. It's just supporters, exile, or I don't know how you would explain it. But what is the dynamics of that? Because they at some point you notice them as even more vicious. Sort of supporters of Israel than some sort of more liberal supporters of Israel, conduct themselves. They're sometimes even more vicious.
Yeah, it was
there's a lot of, and even they're more anti-Semitic than
extremely, yes. It's a really weird, it's very much like when Proud Boys if Proud Boys and avowed Zionists get together to destroy encampments. That's also a really weird combination. But yeah, these Iranian, so for those who don't know, at the UCLA encampment, a week or two ago, there was I'm sure we saw images of the encampments being brutalized by what they were calling counter-protesters, but were really just a sort of roving band of fascists, basically. who quite brutalized the protesters. Many, if not most of them, were of Iranian origin, some Jewish, but mostly not. So who are these people? Yeah, and like, what is their deal? The Iranian diaspora, it has been, like many other communities, it's actually not in agreement on the issue of Israel and Palestine. Not only the diaspora, but Iranians in general. You see this in the country as well, discourses in the country as well. Since 1979, because the government, which is quite unpopular, particularly in the diaspora, has been so avowedly and sort of singularly, rhetorically I don't like the terms pro-Palestine and pro-Israel. It's kind of like, it's a little silly, but has been so sort of championing the Palestinian cause, in some Iranians' view, to the detriment of the country, right? Like putting it in a position as a rogue state, that kind of thing. There has been a staunch backlash against that, both among like right-wing and royalist forces who are among those who beat up the students last week, and among more sort of ordinary people and even some liberals and so forth. There's a kind of like, there's been a lot of writing, both in Persian and English, from really important intellectuals, people who are senior scholars in my field, writing about how Iranians, regardless of their religious background, could and should and do largely support Israel. Now, I think numerically that's not true, but it's clear that since 1979, what was largely a consensus among the overwhelming majority of Iranians has broken down, because a consensus of sympathy for Palestinians has broken down along what are essentially Iranian political lines. And the way that I would actually describe it is that you see this in the solidarity side as well. People understand movements that are not their own, some through lenses that are not indigenous to those movements, right, or not about those movements. Sometimes in ways that are really ahistorical, and other times in ways that are earnest, but like still not exactly, like some of the black activists I was talking about. When Malcolm X, at one point Malcolm X goes to Gaza in 1964. He goes to Khan Yunis. And at that point, Khan Yunis is a refugee community. It's almost all refugees from 48, and it still is, and what's left of it. But Malcolm goes and one of the things that he says, other than support for the Palestinian movement, is he says that he recognizes basically the violence around him as the same as the violence that he grew up with. That is something that black intellectuals have said again and again. But black intellectuals of varying stripes, like Ta-Nehisi Coates recently said that, or like a couple of years ago said this too, that if you go to occupied Palestine, if you, as a black person, go to East Jerusalem or the West Bank, you see the color line in play in a way that you haven't in this generation ever in your life. And he says that he went as a relatively unaffiliated with any side and came back with a completely different view, right? And sometimes I read the statements, as a Middle East scholar, I sometimes read those statements, especially if they're longer, and think like, oh, this is like kind of ahistorical, actually. Like, Malcolm X doesn't actually see in some sense, he's grafting something onto Khan Yunis that is not, Khan Yunis is not identical to his situation, right? I always tell my students to think about those specificities as being really, really important. But where the historian sees specificity, like people make connections in their politics all the time. And that's people who we may agree with and people who we disagree with. But the Iranian right-wingers that you're talking about, the sort of essentially Iranian fascists, they're people who have been, and there has been a rising sort of far-right populist movement that supports the Shah. Like one of the people who beat up protesters was wearing a T-shirt with the son of the Shah that was overthrown. That's corny, but the crown prince of nothing. But yeah, this is just part of Iranian politics. It's part of the Iranian diaspora, and it really doesn't have very much to do with Palestine. But they clearly see they clearly see those people as a threat to something. I don't know. I want to do more research on it. I'll have a better answer for you in a year.
I think that today, or maybe yesterday, most of their names were released. One of them was an Armenian neo-Nazi.
Oh, really? Yeah, they're like, so it's like...
Yeah, it was missed because one of the Jewish students made fun of white people. That's why he came. So it's all very complicated.
Yeah, these racial politics are complicated. But there is a broader Iranian diaspora backlash. I have seen it, and it's grown. A kind of nostalgia for the Shah, that kind of thing. And it's partly born of the fact that it's been an authoritarian context of a new kind for the last 50 years.
Not to take my work hat off, but I was just curious if you could share what, if any, like impacts like outside like community groups or organizations played in the like successful student protest movements you both have highlighted, and like if so, like if they're helpful, like what advice or what things do you think community groups here can do to support Dartmouth students and their efforts for divestment and so on?
I have a really short answer. So in assembling this and doing the research for this, I found it a little difficult to focus only on students. And I think that's because students are somehow like the aesthetic tip of larger protest movements, even in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So student movements are easy to find, but it's pretty clear that most of the people involved behind the scenes are not students. So I'm alluding to what I think you were alluding to, that there's a huge network of community members, organizations like the NAACP, for example, which are allowing SNCC and SDS and the Dartmouth protesters to do what they do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you know, when I said that the students, their ambitions were bigger than campus, in part it's because their networks are much bigger than campus. You know, they're organizing on campus because they understand universities as an important node of knowledge production. It's where they are. It's people who might be able to influence things. But they also see themselves as much bigger, part of much bigger movements. You know, the Iranian students hanging banners on the Statue of Liberty, for instance. They're working, when the UCLA commencement thing that I described happens, you know, they organized in such a way, they weren't allowing non-student, you know, people who didn't have tickets to go into the commencement, but they had their networks of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of protesters outside the building too, and that's how many of them avoided arrest. So every single one of these actions is like that, and that's true of right-wing organizing too. I mean, the whole point, like the sort of narrative of outside agitators is, I mean, it's a trope. It's something that Professor Rabik talks about as something that we recognize from the civil rights era as a trope and a racist trope ultimately, but and often an anti-Semitic trope, right? Like the idea of people pulling the strings in a way that is quite unsavory to our sensibilities. But the reality is people know, like students know non-students. It's like a really simple fact. Students know non-students. And once they're organizing, they work with organizers. And really the great student movements in the Middle East, in Europe, and the US, like often their point of contact for these things is labor. Like May 68th, it's 10 million people in the streets of France and Paris because there's not 10 million students. It's because students had organized so closely with labor for so long that wildcat strikes could emerge in that context. And that's true. The Iranian student revolutionaries in Iran, they brought the country to a grinding halt because they had been working so closely with the bus driver unions. And we see this all the time. Like even in New York, bus drivers refused to drive the buses that arrested students were on. So the first point of contact with student movements is often labor. I couldn't stick to the students either, just because these are like, I couldn't even tell sometimes who was and wasn't a student in the material I was reading, because the students themselves didn't care. They weren't trying to worry about that.
This is potentially a time-wise unanswerable question, but y'all talk a lot about magazines and newspapers specifically, and I'm curious over your research and just generally like lifetime, the shift in mass media to social media and the ways that is impacting like social movements, in particular protest movements, kind of on these broader scales of connecting these movements. And have you seen like a direct shift linked to things like Twitter, TikTok, et cetera, kind of globally, and also like in expediting kind of globalization of these movements?
I'll answer quickly. On the Middle Eastern side, yeah, of course. I mean, I think the movement today, the last 7 months have shown us the power of watching daily violence that we wouldn't otherwise be exposed to without the internet, and how deeply affecting that can be, you know. I've never seen something politicize so many people on a Middle East topic before. I mean, I was, as myself as a student, when I was in the early 2000s, I was really like committed to the anti-Iraq war movement. It was extremely hard to get people to care because they weren't seeing those images on a day-to-day level. I mean, some people cared intuitively, but not everyone did. Seeing the images makes a big difference. At the same time, there's also clearly malign sort of effects of social media too, because all those same things I was saying, it's like in the 60s, if the CIA was funding journals, now we know that they're funding bot armies, and not just the CIA. I'm like, I think that's a bot, but I don't know if it's Islamic Republic or is it Israeli or Saudi or Iran. Until someone uncovers those things, and 50 years from now, historians have access to some of those files, it's going to be really hard to. And even some of the huge, there's been these like vicious debates internally between communities of Iranians, of Arabs, of whatever, and I think this is also happening in the Jewish community. And with the Iranian community, at least the early research is showing that some of those rifts are happening in ways that are clearly being influenced by by governments, by outside forces, in some cases by movement, by organizations. I haven't put it all together. I don't have like a definitive answer then, right? But clearly the internet, the way in which internet information travels, both, it can be leveraged by movements. It can also, it makes security much harder. It makes doxing much easier. It makes all sorts of things really, really different from even when I was a student activist, let alone when people were student activists in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out. It's going to take a lot to get through it, though. I think Brooke told me that we have to wrap up right at 6:30 because there's going to be a class afterwards, so we took 5 more minutes than I was hoping to take. Thank you guys so much for coming.